Imagine you're walking through a dense African forest when the sound of movement suddenly comes from the trees ahead. You stop. You look through the vegetation, and there, only a short distance away, is a gorilla. For a moment, you don't know what to do. You imagine that a gorilla would immediately react to seeing a human. Maybe it would stare, maybe it would come toward you, maybe it would see you as a threat, but the gorilla simply watches. And now a strange question enters your mind. What does a gorilla actually notice when it sees a human? Because we usually look at a gorilla and ask what it's doing. But what if we turn the question around? What is the gorilla noticing about us? Our movement, our posture, our distance, our behavior, and perhaps most importantly, whether we're behaving like a threat. Today, we're going to follow that encounter from the human side, and then look at it from the gorilla's world. Because the closer you look, the more interesting this meeting becomes. Our observer has stopped moving. He's nervous. His imagination starts creating possibilities. Maybe the gorilla is angry. Maybe it's about to come closer. Maybe it doesn't want him there. But the gorilla hasn't actually done any of those things. It's simply watching, and that moment is important. Because humans often assume that if an animal looks at us, it's trying to understand us in exactly the same way we try to understand it. But gorillas don't experience the world like humans do. So instead of asking, "What is this gorilla thinking about me?" we should first ask something more useful. What information is the gorilla getting from me? The first thing it can notice is movement. Imagine our observer suddenly takes a step. The gorilla can see that change. Now imagine the observer stops. The entire situation changes again. For a social animal like a gorilla, body position and behavior can carry important information. A person standing quietly at a distance is different from someone moving quickly toward the group. And that difference matters. Because before we imagine some dramatic thought inside the gorilla's mind, we need to remember something simple. The gorilla doesn't need to know your name. It doesn't need to understand human language. It can respond to what you are actually doing, your movements, your proximity, your behavior, and the situation around you. Now imagine the observer lowers his body slightly and stays still. The gorilla continues watching. This is where our human brain might say, "It must be curious about me." Maybe, but we shouldn't automatically turn animal behavior into a human sentence. Instead, we can look at what science tells us about gorillas. Gorillas are highly social animals. They live in groups with relationships, hierarchies, communication, and complex social interactions. That means their world isn't simply about finding food and avoiding danger. A huge part of their lives involves other individuals. They constantly receive information from the animals around them, and that makes their social world incredibly important. Now imagine the gorilla isn't only looking at our observer. Other gorillas are nearby. One individual moves, another changes position. The group responds. Suddenly, our observer realizes something. He's not watching one animal in isolation. He's standing near a social world, and the gorilla is constantly paying attention to what happens around them. Their communication isn't limited to one sound or one gesture. Gorillas use a range of vocalizations, body postures, facial expressions, gestures, and other behaviors during social interactions. So when we see a gorilla make a particular movement, it may be part of a much larger communication system. And this is where things become fascinating, because humans are also constantly communicating without words. We use our posture, our facial expressions, our movements, our distance from other people. We even change the way we move when we're nervous. A gorilla doesn't need to understand the sentence inside your head to observe those outward signals. It can respond to what your body is doing. But now comes the question that makes this encounter even more interesting. Does a gorilla actually recognize individual humans? The answer isn't as simple as saying every gorilla looks at every person and immediately knows who they are. We shouldn't make that claim. But gorillas are capable of recognizing and remembering individuals within their own social lives. And research on great apes has revealed sophisticated abilities involving recognition, learning, memory, and social relationships. So it's reasonable to ask whether repeated experiences with particular humans can become meaningful information. Imagine the same observer appearing again and again in a gorilla's environment. The first encounter is unfamiliar. The next one isn't necessarily the same. The animal may have previous experience to draw from, and that brings us to a much more interesting idea. Maybe the important question isn't, does the gorilla think I'm a good person or a bad person? Maybe it's, Has this individual learned something about what usually happens when a human is searches? That's a very different kind of intelligence. And it doesn't require the gorilla to think in words. It requires learning from experience. Now imagine our observer sees the gorilla looking directly toward him. His brain immediately creates a story. It knows I'm here. It understands me. It must be thinking something about me. But the real story may be more subtle. The gorilla could be assessing the situation, watching movement, monitoring distance, responding to other members of the group, or simply remaining aware of what is happening around it. We don't have to turn every behavior into a human thought to appreciate how intelligent it is. In fact, that's one of the biggest mistakes we make when studying animal minds. We either make animals seem completely emotionless, or we make them sound exactly like humans. The truth is usually much more fascinating. A gorilla doesn't need to think like us to notice us. It doesn't need to understand our world the way we do. It has its own way of experiencing the world, its own social rules, its own communication, its own memories, and its own way of deciding how to respond to what happens around it. So imagine our observer slowly backing away. The gorilla remains where it is. The forest becomes quiet again. And suddenly, the question has changed. At the beginning, we asked, "What does the gorilla think about me?" But perhaps that's the wrong question. A better question is, what does the gorilla learn from the way I behave? Because when a gorilla looks at a human, we may never know the exact thought inside its mind. But we can study its behavior. We can study its communication. We can study its memory and social intelligence. And when we do, something becomes clear. The gorilla isn't simply a powerful animal looking back at us. It's a social mind observing a world of relationships, movements, signals, and experiences. And maybe the most surprising part of meeting a gorilla isn't realizing that it thinks exactly like a human. It's realizing that it doesn't have to. Because once you stop asking animals to think like us, you start noticing how intelligent their own minds really are. The next time you see a gorilla looking at you, don't just wonder what you see in its eyes. Ask yourself something deeper. What might it be noticing about the world that you're standing inside? Because when one intelligent mind encounters another, the most fascinating story may be the one neither of them can explain in words.